They told society she was convalescing. In truth, Evelyn's family banished her to the damp, forgotten edges of Somerset because her sharp tongue and scarred hand made her a liability on the London marriage mart. She was supposed to rot quietly. She wasn't supposed to write a scathing, legally precise letter to the most ruthless landowner in England. And he certainly wasn't supposed to abandon the season and ride for 3 straight days through torrential rain just to look her in the eye. The roof of Oakhaven Manor did not leak in a way that suggested romantic decay. It leaked with the persistent, irritating rhythm of a dripping tap, pooling dirty rainwater onto the warped floorboards of the library. Evelyn Halloway ignored the sound. She had spent 3 years ignoring much worse. She sat at the heavy oak desk, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The fire had died an hour ago, and coals were a luxury the Halloway estate could no longer afford to waste on a banished daughter. Her right hand, wrapped tightly in a frayed woolen glove, held a rusted pen nib. Beneath the wool, the puckered, burn-scarred flesh was stiff with the cold. The accident had happened when she was 14. A knocked-over oil lamp, a frantic attempt to save her younger sister's silk dress. The dress burned anyway. Her hand was ruined, and with it, according to her mother, went her future. A woman who could not play the pianoforte or hold a teacup with effortless grace had no place in Mayfair. So, at 21, while her sisters were paraded through ballrooms, Evelyn was shipped to the country. Out of sight, out of mind. Miss Evelyn. She didn't look up. She was busy grinding cheap, gritty ink into the inkwell. If that is about the roof in the West Wing, Mrs. Higgins, put a bucket under it. We have no money for Thatcher. It isn't the roof, miss. The housekeeper stepped into the dim light. She looked exhausted. Everyone in Somerset looked exhausted. It's the lower fields. The river has breached the banks again. Miller's farm is completely flooded. He's lost his winter wheat. 2 of his calves are dead in the mud. Evelyn's hand stopped. The nib caught the rough parchment, snapping with a sharp crack. She slowly raised her head. The lower fields bordered the massive, sprawling estate of the Duke of Westmoreland. 6 months ago, the Duke's land agents had dammed a portion of the tributary to create an ornamental lake for a hunting lodge he had never even visited. That dam diverted the runoff directly into Oakhaven's most vulnerable tenant farms. Evelyn had written to the land agent twice. She had received silence. "Bring me the ledger," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by the sheer, exhausting reality of survival. "And a new pen. Miss, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to write a letter. To Mr. Gable? The agent won't read it. He tossed the last one in the fire. The butcher boy saw him do it." Evelyn took the fresh pen Mrs. Higgins handed her. She stripped the woolen glove from her right hand, wincing as the cold air hit the tight, scarred skin. She needed a steady grip. She needed precision. "I am not writing to the agent," Evelyn said, dipping the nib. "I am writing to the master." "Your Grace," she wrote. She stared at the words. Too polite. She crossed them out with a thick, violent slash of black ink. "To the Duke of Westmoreland, it is a profound luxury to be so wealthy that your ignorance can drown a man's livelihood. I am writing to inform you that the dam your agents erected on the southern border of the Wickerling tributary is a triumph of aesthetic engineering and a catastrophic failure of basic geography." Evelyn's hand flew across the page. She didn't use the polite, meandering prose taught by her governesses. She wrote with the blunt, brutal clarity of a woman who had just spent the morning wrapping a dead calf in a canvas sack. She cited property law dating back to 1742. She detailed the exact volume of water displacement. She calculated the financial ruin of 3 separate families down to the last shilling, placing the blood of their starving livestock squarely on his tailored, absent shoulders. She didn't plead. She didn't ask for charity. She demanded the destruction of the dam, threatening to hire local laborers to dismantle it herself with pickaxes if he did not comply within the fortnight. I do not expect a man who builds lakes for a house he does not inhabit to understand the value of dry land, she concluded. But I expect a man who holds a seat in the House of Lords to understand the legal definition of criminal negligence. Send the order, or I will send the pickaxes. B. Halloway. She didn't sign it, miss. He would assume she was a man, a brother, an uncle. It didn't matter. She blew on the ink, folded the heavy parchment, and sealed it with a blob of cheap red wax. She pressed her thumb into it. No crest, just a thumbprint. Send it to London. Evelyn told Mrs. Higgins, handing over the letter. Use the emergency funds for the postage. He won't read it, Miss Evelyn. The old woman sighed, taking the letter as if it were a live coal. Dukes do not read letters from Somerset. Then I will buy the pickaxes tomorrow, Evelyn said. She pulled her glove back over her ruined hand and turned back to the ledgers. Roland Pendleton, the 9th Duke of Westmoreland, was staring at a crystal chandelier and contemplating the precise height of the drop required to break his own neck. He stood in the corner of Lady Danbury's ballroom, nursing a glass of watered-down brandy. The room was a suffocating sea of silk, sweat, and ambition. The string quartet was playing a waltz that sounded like a dirge. Mothers circled him like sharks smelling blood in the water, their daughters trailing behind them with wide, vacant eyes and rehearsed giggles. Roland was 32. He was unmarried. He was obscenely, irredeemably wealthy. That was all anyone knew, and all anyone cared to know. Your Grace. Roland didn't blink. He just swallowed the rest of the terrible brandy. What is it, Hastings? His secretary, a small, nervous man who smelled faintly of ink and peppermint, shifted on his feet. Lady Agatha is approaching from your left, sir. She has her youngest daughter with her, the one who plays the harp. Tell them I have contracted cholera, Roland said dryly. I used that excuse on Tuesday, Your Grace. The ton is beginning to wonder about your constitution. Roland finally turned his head. His eyes, a hard slate grey, swept over the crowd. There was no joy here, only transactions. Marriage was a contract, conversation was a negotiation, and every smile was a calculated down payment. He was so incredibly tired of it all. Get my coat, Hastings. We are leaving. But the supper hasn't been served. Now, 20 minutes later, Roland was sitting in the heavy, leather-bound silence of his study at Westmoreland House. The fire was roaring, the brandy here was excellent, and yet the hollow feeling in his chest remained. He unfastened his cravat, letting the crisp white linen fall away from his throat. The afternoon post, Your Grace, Hastings said, stepping into the room and placing a silver tray on the mahogany desk. It was piled high with cream-colored envelopes, invitations, and begging letters. Burn the invitations. Give begging letters to the almoner. Roland waved a dismissive hand. There is one. Oddity, sir. Hastings hesitated, holding up a piece of rough, cheap parchment sealed with a messy thumbprint. It arrived from the country, Somerset. I would have discarded it, but the language on the exterior directed to you was somewhat aggressive. Roland raised an eyebrow. He held out his hand. Hastings passed the letter over. Roland broke the waxed seal. He unfolded the stiff paper. He expected a plea for money. He expected a sycophantic request for patronage. He read the first line. It is a profound luxury to be so wealthy that your ignorance can drown a man's livelihood. Roland sat up straighter in his leather chair. The boredom that had coated his mind for months suddenly fractured. He read the next line, and the next. His eyes darted across the page, absorbing the brutal, unapologetic words. The handwriting was sharp, heavily pressed into the paper, as if the writer had been furious. The legal citations were flawless. The mathematical calculations regarding the water displacement were brilliant. but it was the tone that captivated him. It was pure, unadulterated rage. No one spoke to him like this. No one had spoken to him like this since his father died. Everyone deferred. Everyone flattered. This B. Halloway didn't give a damn about his title. This person cared about dead calves and ruined winter wheat. Send the order, or I will send the pickaxes. Roland read the letter a second time, then a third. A slow, unfamiliar sensation crept up the back of his neck. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was respect. "Hastings," Roland said. His voice was quiet, but the lethargy was entirely gone from it. "Sir." "Who manages the Wickling estate in Somerset?" "A Mr. Gable, I believe, Your Grace. We acquired that tract of land 3 years ago. You ordered a hunting lodge built there last spring." "Did I?" Roland looked at the fire. He owned so much land he couldn't keep track of it all. The thought disgusted him slightly. "It seems Mr. Gable built a dam, and it is flooding a neighbour's tenant farms. I can send a dispatch to Gable, sir, inquiring into the matter." "No." Roland stood up. He threw his cravat onto the desk. He looked at the crude, thumbprint wax seal on the letter. He traced it with his index finger. It was small, too small for a man's thumb. He looked closely at the handwriting again. The heavy pressure, the sharp angles. But there, in the loops of the Y and the G, a slight tremor. A weakness in the grip compensated for by sheer force. "B. Halloway. Have my horse saddled, Hastings, the big roan, and pack my saddlebags." Hastings blinked, his mouth falling slightly open. "Saddlebags, Your Grace. Are you going to one of your country estates? Shall I prepare the carriage?" "No carriage. I am riding." "Riding? To where, sir?" "Somerset." Hastings dropped his notebook. "Somerset? Your Grace, it is nearly 150 miles. The weather is turning. The roads will be thick with mud. And the Duchess of Cleves's ball is on Friday." "To hell with the ball," Roland said, striding towards the door. "And to hell with the mud. I need to meet a man about some pickaxes." He paused in the doorway, glancing back at the letter on his desk. "Or," Roland murmured to himself, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "A woman." The journey took 3 days. It was not a grand, romantic ride through rolling green hills. It was a brutal, punishing slog through a relentless, driving rain that turned the king's highways into rivers of thick, sucking mud. Roland slept in terrible wayside inns that smelled of old ale and wet wool. He ate stale bread and tough mutton. His expensive leather riding boots were caked in grey filth, and his heavy riding cloak was soaked through to the lining. He was cold, he was exhausted, and his muscles burned from the hours in the saddle. He had never felt better. Every mile that put distance between him and London stripped away a layer of his suffocating apathy. By the time he crossed the border into Somerset, he felt awake for the first time in a decade. He found the Wickling tributary on the morning of the 3rd day. The rain had finally slowed to a dismal drizzle. He rode along the ridge, looking down into the valley. The letter had not exaggerated. The dam, a stupid, ostentatious structure of stone and mortar, blocked the natural flow of the water, creating a placid, dead lake on Roland's side of the boundary. But below the dam, on the Halloway lands, the diverted water had turned the fields into a drowned, devastated swamp. The tops of wooden fences barely breached the water's surface. Roland stared at the destruction, his jaw tight. This was done in his name. Because he had been too bored to read the reports. Because he had trusted a land agent who cared more about aesthetic landscaping than human survival. He spurred his horse forward, following the muddy lane that led toward the Halloway estate. He expected a crumbling manor. He found one. Oakhaven was a casualty of time and poverty. The stone was black with damp, the ivy was dead, and several windows on the upper floors were boarded up. There was no footman to take his horse. There was no one at the front door. Roland dismounted, tying the roan's reins to an iron ring on the mossy stone wall. He walked toward the rear of the house, following the sound of shouting. He rounded the corner to the stable-yard and stopped. The yard was a sea of muck. In the center of it, a heavy wooden wagon was tipped on its side, the rear axle buried deep in the mud. A terrified draft horse was plunging and straining against the traces. And right in the thick of it, up to her shins in the filth, was a woman. She wore a faded woolen dress, the hem tied up around her knees, exposing thick, practical boots. Her hair, a dark, heavy mahogany, had escaped its pins and hung in wet, plastered strands across her face. She was small, but she moved with a frantic, commanding energy. "Steady him, Tom! Pull his head down! Don't let him rear!" she shouted to a terrified, scrawny stable boy who was hanging onto the horse's bridle. She waded deeper into the mud, shoving her shoulder against the tilted bed of the wagon. "When I say heave, you back him up, you understand? We have to relieve the tension on the axle or it will snap." Roland stood perfectly still, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He watched her. She braced her boots in the sludge. She wasn't wearing gloves. As she gripped the edge of the wooden wagon, Roland saw her right hand. The skin across the back and down to the knuckles was white, puckered, and terribly scarred. The joints looked stiff. But she gripped the wood with a desperate, white-knuckled ferocity. "Now, Tom, back him up." The boy pulled. The woman shoved with all her weight. The wagon groaned, shifting an inch, then sank back into the mud with a sickening squelch. The woman stepped back, chest heaving, wiping rain and mud from her face with her forearm, leaving a brown streak across her pale cheek. She swore. It wasn't a polite, drawing-room curse. It was a filthy, creative expletive that made Roland's eyebrows jump toward his hairline. She turned, grabbing a long, heavy iron pry bar from the dry ground near the stable door. She lifted it, struggling slightly with the weight due to her scarred hand, and marched back into the mud. Roland finally moved. He stepped off the cobblestones, his expensive boots sinking instantly into the muck. He walked up behind her just as she raised the iron bar to wedge it under the wheel. "The fulcrum is wrong," Roland said. Evelyn spun around, startled. The iron bar slipped from her grip and splashed into the mud. She stared at the man standing in her yard. He was tall, extremely tall. He was covered in days of road dirt, his riding cloak heavy with rain. But beneath the grime, the cut of his coat and the severe, aristocratic lines of his face betrayed him instantly. This was not a local farmer. "Who the hell are you?" Evelyn demanded, her voice sharp and breathless. She didn't cower. She didn't curtsy. She stood in the mud, glaring at him. "A man who knows basic physics," Roland replied, calmly. He reached down into the freezing mud and hauled the heavy iron bar out. He didn't flinch at the dirt. He stepped past her, wedging the bar deeply under the buried axle, angling it against a submerged rock. "Take the wheel," Roland ordered. Evelyn blinked. No one ordered her around in her own yard. But the wagon needed moving, and he was already leaning his considerable weight against the iron bar. She waded over to the large wooden wheel, gripping the muddy spokes. "On 3, Roland said, his voice a low, steady rumble over the rain. 1, 2, 3. He threw his weight down on the bar, his shoulders strained beneath the wet wool of his coat. Evelyn pulled up on the wheel with everything she had, ignoring the screaming ache in her scarred hand. The mud made a loud, sucking sound. The wagon lurched, the axle popped free, and the heavy cart settled back onto all 4 wheels. The stable boy immediately led the trembling horse forward to solid ground. Evelyn stood chest deep in the rain, panting, staring at the stranger. He was breathing heavily, his hands slick with grey mud. He casually wiped them on the sides of his ruined trousers. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her tone guarded. "I suppose you are lost. The King's Road is 2 miles west." "I am not lost," Roland said. He turned to face her fully, his slate-grey eyes locked onto hers. They were incredibly intense, missing nothing. They flicked down to her right hand, resting momentarily on the scarred flesh before rising back to her face. There was no pity in his gaze, just calculation. "I am looking for a B. Halloway," he said. Evelyn stiffened, her chin lifted. "I am Evelyn Halloway. And you are?" Roland reached into the inner pocket of his soaked cloak. He pulled out a folded piece of parchment, protected by a leather slip. The red wax thumbprint was still visible. "I am Westmoreland," Roland said, his voice deadpan. I received your letter. I understand you are in the market for some pickaxes." The silence stretched, heavy and thick with the sound of rain drumming against the mud. Evelyn stared at the man. The Duke of Westmoreland. He was supposed to be a phantom, a signature on a lease, a distant shadow cast from London. He was not supposed to be standing in her stable yard, covered in horse manure and grey sludge, looking at her as if she were a complicated knot he wanted to untie. "You are Westmoreland," she repeated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I am." Roland didn't move. He let her look. He knew what she saw, a man of the ton, out of his element, reeking of wet wool and bad decisions. "Your letter was persuasive. I came to see the dam." Evelyn let out a harsh, abrupt laugh. It scraped against the damp air. "You rode from London in this weather, to look at rocks." "I rode from London to look at the water displacement," Roland corrected, his voice deadpan. "Your calculations regarding the hydrostatic pressure were fascinating. I had to verify them." She didn't smile. She just tightened her grip on her wet, muddy skirts. "The mudroom is through the back door. You will leave your boots there. I cannot afford to replace the floorboards if they rot." She turned her back on a peer of the realm and sludged toward the house. Roland watched her go. For a decade, women had carefully orchestrated their movements around him, fluttering fans and tilting their heads to catch the candlelight. Evelyn Halloway walked like a soldier retreating from a lost trench. He pulled his boots from the mud with a wet pop and followed her. The interior of Oakhaven was colder than the yard. The damp had settled into the plaster, bringing with it the smell of old ash and decaying wood. Evelyn led him into a massive, cavernous kitchen. A single pathetic fire burned in the hearth. Mrs. Higgins, who was aggressively scrubbing a copper pot, dropped it with a clatter. She stared at Roland. She looked at his height, the severe cut of his jaw, and the undeniable arrogance woven into the fabric of his ruined clothes. She dropped into a deep, terrified curtsy. "Get up, Mrs. Higgins." Evelyn sighed, grabbing a coarse towel from a hook. She began scrubbing the muck from her hands, wincing slightly as the rough cloth caught on the scarred tissue of her right hand. "This is the Duke of Westmoreland. He is here to look at the dam." "Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins whispered, trembling. "We have the tea is—" "Water will be fine," Roland said. He unfastened his heavy riding cloak. The water pooled around his feet. He looked at Evelyn. "You have ruined your hands." "I have ruined a dress," she corrected sharply. "My hands are for working. Yours, I imagine, are for holding crystal goblets." "Occasionally. Mostly they hold ledgers." Roland threw his wet cloak over a wooden chair. "You assumed I was ignorant of the dam. You were correct. I signed a blanket authorization for estate improvements last year. I did not read the localized plans for Somerset." Evelyn stopped drying her hands. She looked at him, genuinely thrown. People of his station did not admit fault. They deflected. They blamed subordinates. "You admit it?" she said, narrowing her eyes. "I admit I was careless," Roland said, pulling a wooden stool from beneath a scarred work table and sitting down. The stool creaked ominously under his weight, but he ignored it. My agent, Gable, is a fool, but he is my fool. The responsibility is mine. I will cover the cost of the dead livestock, the ruined wheat, and the structural damage to your tenant farms." Evelyn stared at him. A small, desperate part of her wanted to sag against the stone wall and weep with relief. The money, the survival of Miller's farm. It was handed to her in a few blunt sentences. But cynicism ran deep in her blood. Survival had taught her to distrust sudden miracles. "Why?" she asked. Roland frowned. "Why am I paying you? Why are you here? You could have sent a draft from Coots Bank. You could have sent a clerk." Evelyn walked over to the table, bracing her hands against the wood. Dukes do not ride for 3 days in a torrential downpour to personally hand over a check for 2 dead calves. Roland looked at her hands. The left was pale and smooth. The right was a map of old violence. He met her gaze. Her eyes were hazel, sharp, and entirely devoid of deference. "I came," Roland said slowly, "because your letter was the first honest thing I have read in 5 years, and because I needed to know if you would actually swing a pickaxe." Evelyn held his stare. "If you don't tear that dam down by tomorrow morning, Your Grace, I will show you exactly how well I swing it." The rain stopped an hour later, leaving a thick, heavy mist clinging to the valley. Roland did not wait for his clothes to dry. He insisted on seeing the dam immediately. Evelyn refused to let him go alone. She pulled on a heavy, moth-eaten wool coat and led him across the ridge. They walked in silence. Roland's stride was long and effortless. Evelyn had to work to keep up, her heavy boots slipping on the wet grass. He noticed. He slowed his pace. He didn't offer her his arm. He sensed she would likely bite him if he tried. But he kept himself positioned on the downhill slope, a silent barrier between her and the steep drop to the river. They reached the crest of the hill. Below them, the Wickerling Dam stood like a fortress. It was built of imported grey stone, completely out of place in the Somerset landscape. On Roland's side, the water was a smooth, glassy lake reflecting the grey sky. On Evelyn's side, the valley was a choked, muddy wasteland. "Good God," Roland muttered. Seeing it in person was vastly different from reading about it on parchment. Gable wanted a reflection pool for the lodge. Evelyn said, her voice flat. "He told Miller that progress required sacrifice. Miller has 5 children. Gable's progress cost them their winter provisions." Roland stared at the massive stone wall. "It is mortared. We cannot simply knock it down with axes. We need gunpowder to breach the center and laborers to dismantle the sides." "Gunpowder?" Evelyn looked at him. "That will flood the lower valley. Not if we breach it in sections and control the flow." Roland stepped closer to the edge of the ridge, his mind calculating. He was a man accustomed to solving massive logistical problems. This was merely a problem with dirt and water instead of shipping routes and trade tariffs. If we open a spillway on the eastern flank, we can drain the lake by a foot an hour. It will give the riverbed time to absorb the overflow. Evelyn watched him. The boredom she had assumed was inherent to his class was completely absent. His face was sharp with focus. "You understand engineering?" she noted, mildly surprised. "My father insisted on it. He believed a man who owns mines should know how a support beam works." Roland turned to her. "Where does Gable reside?" "In the village, 3 miles from here. I will send a message. He will bring his records, the estate funds, and every able-bodied man he has currently employed on my lands." "Gable won't listen to a message. He acts as a king in this county." "He acts as a king because I have been an absent god," Roland said quietly. The truth of his own words tasted like ash. "That ends today." A sound from the valley floor drew their attention. A man on a grey gelding was riding along the edge of the flooded field. He wore a fine wool coat and a high, stiff collar. Speak of the devil, Evelyn said, her jaw tightening. That is Gable. Roland's eyes locked onto the rider. The sheer, unadulterated fury that had been simmering in his gut since he read Evelyn's letter finally found a target. Wait here, Roland said. He didn't walk down the hill. He descended it with a terrifying, predatory grace, his long legs eating up the distance. Evelyn watched, her heart giving a strange, uncomfortable thump against her ribs. She followed. By the time she reached the valley floor, Roland had intercepted the agent. Gable was looking down at Roland with a sneer of utter disdain. "You are trespassing on Westmoreland land," Gable was saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "Get off this estate before I have you arrested for vagrancy." Roland stood in the mud, looking up at the man on the horse. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. "Get off the horse, Gable." The quiet authority in the command made the agent pause. Gable looked closer at the filthy, towering man standing before him. He took in the cut of the ruined coat, the expensive leather of the boots beneath the mud, and finally, the hard, slate-gray eyes. Recognition dawned, slow and horrifying. All the color drained from Gable's face. Your Grace?" Gable whispered. "The horse." Now, Gable practically fell out of the saddle, landing heavily in the mud. He scrambled to his feet, bowing frantically. "Your Grace, we had no warning. If I had known you were coming, if you had known I was coming, you would have hidden the evidence of your incompetence." Roland cut in, his voice like cracking ice. He gestured to the flooded fields. "Explain this. It is a temporary overflow, Your Grace. The rains have been unusually heavy. The lake is a magnificent addition to the property. It is a monument to your stupidity." Roland said, "You dammed a tributary without reinforcing the lower banks. You destroyed my neighbor's livelihood." "Neighbor?" Gable scoffed nervously, glancing at Evelyn as she approached. "She is a spinster living in a ruin, Your Grace. Her family abandoned her here. The Halloways have no standing. The land is practically worthless." Roland stepped forward. He moved so fast Gable didn't have time to flinch. Roland grabbed the front of the agent's fine wool coat and hauled him up onto his toes. "Miss Halloway is a lady," Roland said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And you are a thief, stealing from starving men in my name. You are dismissed." "Dismissed?" Gable choked. "Your Grace, I have a contract." "Sue me," Roland said. He shoved the man backward into the mud. "You have until sunset to vacate the village. Leave the estate ledgers with the local magistrate. If I find a single shilling unaccounted for, I will see you in Newgate." Roland turned his back on the sputtering man. He looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were wide, staring at him as if he were a mythical creature that had just materialized in her swamp. "Now," Roland said, adjusting his cuffs with unnerving calm, "let us discuss where to place the gunpowder." The bridge over the lower Wickerling had completely washed away. Roland discovered this unfortunate fact when he attempted to ride to the local inn as dusk fell. The river, swollen by the dam's runoff and the recent rain, was impassable. He was stranded on the Halloway side of the property. Evelyn received the news with grim resignation. She stood in the damp hallway of Oakhaven, holding a single, sputtering tallow candle. "I cannot offer you the hospitality a duke expects," she said, her tone defensive. "My family does not send an allowance for guests. There is one spare bedchamber that does not leak. You may have it. But we dine on what we have." "I am not expecting pheasant, Miss Halloway. A fire and a chair will suffice." Dinner was a lesson in humility. They sat at a massive, scarred mahogany dining table that could comfortably seat 20. Just the two of them, at opposite ends. The meal was a thin potato stew and dense, crusty bread. Roland ate it without complaint. He ate it, in fact, as if he were starving, scraping the bowl clean. Evelyn watched him from the shadows. She had spent the last 3 years building a fortress around herself, a wall of cynicism and bitter survival. Roland Pendleton was a battering ram. He didn't fit into her neat, categorized hatred of the aristocracy. He was ruthless, yes, but he was useful, and he was incredibly, distractingly observant. After dinner, they moved to the library. It was the only room Mrs. Higgins had managed to warm. A small fire crackled in the grate. Roland sat in a faded wing-back chair, nursing a glass of cheap, burning whiskey Evelyn had found in a dusty cabinet. He stared at the flames. The exhaustion of his journey was finally catching up to him, settling deep into his bones. Evelyn sat opposite him, holding a book she wasn't reading. "Your family hid you here," Roland said suddenly. It wasn't a question. He remembered Gable's cruel words. Evelyn stiffened. She carefully closed the book. Gable spoke out of turn, but he did not lie. "Why?" She looked at him. The firelight caught the harsh angles of his face. He wasn't asking for gossip. He was asking for a fact. Evelyn raised her right hand. She held it in the light, exposing the twisted, pale scars. "I ruined a dress," she said softly. "My younger sister Clara was preparing for her debut. Her gown caught fire. I put it out with my hands. I saved the girl. I lost the hand. And in doing so, I lost my value." Roland looked at the hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer empty platitudes about inner beauty. "Society demands perfection," Evelyn continued, her voice hardening. "A woman is a decorative asset. When the asset is damaged, it is moved to the attic. I was sent here on a convalescence that has lasted 3 years. I will die here." "A tragic fate," Roland murmured. "Unless, of course, the woman discovers she prefers running an estate to smiling at fools in a ballroom." Evelyn blinked. "You think I prefer this?" She gestured to the damp walls, the cheap fire. "I think," Roland said, taking a sip of the terrible whiskey, "that if you were placed back in a Mayfair drawing room tomorrow, you would suffocate. You have tasted authority, Miss Halloway. You ordered me to pull a wagon from the mud. You threatened a duke with a pickaxe. You do not cower. You fight." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The firelight danced in his grey eyes. "They exiled you because they thought you were broken. They were wrong. They just gave you a kingdom they didn't want to manage." Evelyn felt a sudden, sharp tightness in her throat. No one had ever framed her exile as a victory. It had always been a punishment. "And what is your excuse, Your Grace?" she countered, weaponizing her vulnerability to deflect his insight. "You have the world at your feet. You have money, power, unscarred hands. Yet you look as though you haven't slept peacefully in a decade. What are you hiding from?" Roland looked down at his glass. He swirled the amber liquid. "Boredom," he said quietly. "A profound, soul-crushing apathy. I inherited the dukedom when I was 22. My father died suddenly. One day I was a young man with a future. The next I was a ledger, an institution. People stopped speaking to me. They started speaking to my title." He looked up at her, and Evelyn saw the immense, hollow loneliness in his gaze. "Every smile is a calculation. Every conversation is a transaction. I have spent 10 years surrounded by thousands of people, and I have never felt more entirely alone." He offered a bleak, self-deprecating smile. "Until I received a letter from a woman who called me an ignorant fool and threatened my property." Evelyn couldn't stop the small, genuine smile that tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I did not call you a fool," she pointed out softly. "I merely implied it." "Your subtlety was noted," Roland replied. The silence that fell between them was no longer hostile. It was fragile, built on the unexpected foundation of mutual damage. They were two exiles sitting in a decaying manor, one banished by her family, the other banished by his own privilege. Roland finished his whiskey. He set the glass down. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice lowering to a husky register that sent a strange shiver down Evelyn's spine. "We blow up a dam." "Tomorrow," Evelyn agreed. She looked at her scarred hand, resting in her lap. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the urge to hide it. Morning broke over Somerset like a bruised eye, all purple clouds and dull, aching grey. The village awoke to a spectacle it had never seen, and likely would never see again. The Duke of Westmoreland was not sitting in a velvet carriage. He was standing waist-deep in the freezing, stagnant water of the Wickling Basin, a crowbar in his hand, arguing with a quarry foreman about black powder. Evelyn stood on the bank, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She watched him. The labourers Gable had employed, 30 men who had spent the last 2 days waiting to be fired, were now hauling canvas sacks of explosives down the muddy slope. Roland had doubled their wages at dawn. He had also ordered a hot breakfast carted in from the village inn. Loyalty, he understood, was purchased with silver, but it was secured with meat and bread. "The structural integrity of the mortar is stronger on the western flank," Roland shouted over the wind, pointing a muddy, gloveless finger at the stone face. "If we blast the center, the side walls will collapse inward and choke the riverbed with debris. We need a clean breach." The quarryman, a thick-necked local named Griggs, squinted at the Duke. He wasn't used to peers who understood stress fractures. "Aye, Your Grace, but the shale on the east side is brittle. We pack too much powder there, we'll take down half the hill with it. Then we don't drill into the shale." Evelyn stepped forward. Her boots sank into the mud. She ignored the cold seeping through the leather. She pointed to a jagged seam near the waterline. "The bedrock dips there. My grandfather tried to build a mill precisely on that spot 40 years ago. The foundation cracked in a week because the limestone is hollow underneath. Drill there. The water pressure will do the rest." Griggs looked at Evelyn, then up at Roland. Roland didn't dismiss her. He didn't tell her to return to the house. He stared at the seam she indicated, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the physics. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his dirt-streaked face. "Did you hear the lady, Griggs?" Roland said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute command. "Drill the hollow." It took 3 hours. Evelyn organized the tenant farmers. She sent Miller and his boys downriver to clear the debris screens, ensuring the sudden surge of water wouldn't simply flood the next farm down the line. She worked until her breath came in ragged gasps, her scarred hand throbbing from the damp cold. "Clear the basin," Griggs finally bellowed. The labourers scrambled up the muddy banks. Roland was the last man out of the water. He waded ashore, his boots heavy, his fine woolen trousers ruined beyond salvation. He walked up the ridge to where Evelyn stood. He smelled of sulphur, wet earth, and sweat. It was the most human he had ever smelled. "Fire in the hole!" Griggs yelled, touching a lantern to the long, oil-soaked fuse. The spark hissed, racing down the bank like a bright, angry snake. Roland stepped behind Evelyn. He didn't put his arms around her. He knew she would hate the presumption, but he placed his large, solid frame between her and the wind. "Cover your ears," he murmured. Evelyn raised her hands. The explosion was not a boom, it was a crack, a violent bone-rattling snap that punched the air from Evelyn's lungs. The ground shuddered violently. A geyser of black mud, grey stone, and white water erupted into the sky. For a terrible, breathless second, nothing happened. The smoke cleared, and the dam stood. Then came the groan. It started deep within the limestone. A terrible, grinding shriek of failing mortar. The east wall bowed outward, and then, with the roar of a dying beast, the stone shattered. The dead lake surged forward. It didn't crash. It poured, thick and furious, ripping through the breach. The water churned, carrying chunks of masonry and uprooted trees down into the natural riverbed. Below them, in the flooded fields, the standing water immediately began to recede, sucked back into the fast-moving current. A cheer went up from the labourers. Down in the valley, Miller fell to his knees in the mud, weeping into his hands. Evelyn watched the water drain. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 6 months finally fractured. She let out a shaky breath, her hands dropping from her ears. "It's gone," she whispered. "It's gone." Roland agreed. She turned to look at him. He was watching the river, his jaw set, his eyes bright with a fierce, primitive satisfaction. He wasn't bored anymore. He was intensely, violently alive. He looked down at her. The adrenaline of the blast hung between them, heavy and electric. For a fraction of a second, Evelyn thought he was going to kiss her. His gaze dropped to her mouth, the slate grey of his eyes darkening. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't step back. She held her ground, waiting. But Roland was a man who understood the difference between a skirmish and a siege. He didn't take what wasn't offered. He reached out and, with shocking gentleness, wiped a speck of black mud from her cheek with his thumb. "Come, Miss Holloway," he said quietly. "Let us go inspect our ruin." The Duke of Westmoreland did not return to London. 3 weeks passed. The mud in the lower fields began to dry, leaving behind a thick layer of fertile silt. The winter wheat was lost, but Roland had quietly arranged for a massive shipment of spring barley seed to arrive from his estates in the north. He moved out of Oakhaven's damp, spare room and into the village inn, much to the innkeeper's enduring terror. But he spent his days at the Holloway estate. He sat in Evelyn's freezing library, surrounded by her ledgers. He was a mathematician of power, and he turned his ruthless intellect toward saving her home. He found the leaks in her crop yields, renegotiated the draconian interest rates her father had left on the tenant mortgages, and fired the corrupt grain merchants in the neighboring town who had been underpaying her for years. He didn't do it for her. He did it with her. They fought constantly. They argued over crop rotations, timber yields, and the price of wool. Their arguments were sharp, brilliant, and utterly exhilarating. Evelyn had never been allowed to be loud before. She had never been allowed to be angry, or smart, or uncompromising. Roland demanded all of it. He pushed her, and she pushed back harder. "You cannot sell that timber to the Navy." Evelyn snapped one evening, pacing in front of the library fire. "The transport costs to the shipyards in Portsmouth will eat 1/3 of the profit." Roland leaned back in her father's leathern chair, watching her. He had abandoned his cravat entirely. His shirt collar was open, exposing the strong column of his throat. "Not if we use the canal system. I own a 40% share in the Grand Union Company. They will waive the tolls." Evelyn stopped pacing. She stared at him. "You are cheating." "I am leveraging," Roland corrected smoothly. "It is how the world works, Evelyn. You cannot fight a war without using your artillery." It was the first time he had used her given name. The word hung in the quiet room. The fire popped. The air suddenly felt very thick, the space between them shrinking rapidly. Evelyn looked down at her hands. Her right hand was aching terribly. The dampness of the spring evening had settled into the scarred joints, making them stiff and throbbing. She rubbed the back of her hand absent-mindedly, trying to work the pain out. Roland noticed. He always noticed. He stood up, crossing the room until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so tall. He eclipsed the light from the fire. "Give it to me," he said softly. Evelyn stiffened, hiding her hand behind her back. "It is fine, just the damp." "Evelyn, give me your hand." It wasn't a request. It was a quiet, immovable demand. Slowly, she brought her right hand forward. She hated it. She hated the shiny, puckered skin, the way the knuckles couldn't fully straighten, the sheer ugliness of it. She expected him to look at it with pity. That was what people did. They pitied the broken thing. Roland didn't pity it. He took her hand in both of his. His palms were warm, the calluses from his weeks of riding and working rough against her skin. He didn't examine the scars. He began to massage the joints. His thumbs pressed deep into the stiff muscles, working the cold ache out of the tissue with firm, steady pressure. Evelyn gasped softly, her eyes fluttering shut as the pain slowly began to recede, replaced by the shocking, intense heat of his touch. "You hide it," Roland murmured, his focus entirely on her hand. "You wrap it in wool. You keep it under the table. It is hideous," Evelyn whispered, opening her eyes. She looked at his face. He was staring at her hand as if it were something holy. "It is the hand of a woman who walked into a fire to save her sister," Roland said, his voice rough. He looked up, his slate eyes locking onto hers. "It is the hand that pulled a wagon from the mud. It is the hand that wrote a letter that woke me from a 10-year sleep. There is nothing hideous about it." He lifted her hand. He didn't kiss her fingers. He pressed his lips directly against the worst of the scarring on the back of her hand. The touch was electric. It sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated heat straight to Evelyn's chest. Her breath hitched. No one had ever touched her scars with reverence. No one had ever looked at her brokenness and called it a weapon. Roland lowered her hand, but he didn't let go. He stepped closer. The smell of him, wood smoke, clean linen, and male heat, enveloped her. "I am terrified of you," Roland confessed, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "You are a duke," Evelyn breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You are not terrified of anything. I am terrified," Roland said, reaching up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "That I will return to London, and I will die of boredom because you are not there to shout at me." Evelyn let out a shaky, desperate sound. She grabbed the front of his linen shirt. She didn't wait for him to ask. She pulled him down. The kiss was not polite. It was not a choreographed ballroom graze. It was a collision. Roland's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his chest, lifting her slightly off the floor. His mouth was hot, demanding, and incredibly desperate. Evelyn kissed him back with all the pent-up fury and passion of a woman who had been told for 3 years that she was dead. She wasn't dead. She was burning. He tasted like whiskey and rain. His hands tangled in her heavy hair, pulling the pins free until it tumbled down her back. Evelyn's scarred hand gripped his shoulder, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Roland rested his forehead against hers, his chest heaving. "Ruin," he whispered, a smile touching his lips. "Absolute ruin." Evelyn laughed, a raw, breathless sound. "You started it, and I intend to finish it." Roland pulled back, looking down at her with a fierce, uncompromising possessiveness. "Pack your bags, Evelyn. We are going to London." Evelyn's smile vanished. The reality of the world crashed back down on her, cold and heavy. "I cannot go to London," she said, stepping out of his embrace. The cold air rushed in to replace his heat. "You know I cannot. My family. Your family is irrelevant." "No, Roland, they are not." She wrapped her arms around herself. "You are a duke. You can do whatever you please. You can kiss the spinster in the country and call it an adventure. But if I return to Mayfair, I am the damaged daughter. I am the liability. My mother will lock me in a townhouse, and you will be pressured to marry an earl's daughter who can play the harp." Roland's eyes hardened. The softness vanished, replaced by the ruthless aristocrat who commanded armies of men and millions of pounds. "Do you think so little of me?" he asked quietly. "I think the world is what it is," Evelyn said, her voice cracking, "and we do not fit." Before Roland could answer, a loud, frantic pounding echoed from the front door of the manor. The pounding echoed through the quiet house. Mrs. Higgins, clutching a shawl, scurried down the hallway to unbolt the heavy oak door. Standing on the rain-slicked steps was a man in a pristine, tailored black suit. He looked at the muddy floorboards with profound disgust. "I am Mr. Sterling," the man said, his voice nasal and sharp. "Solicitor to Lord Halloway. I am here to see Miss Evelyn Halloway, immediately." Evelyn stepped out of the library, Roland a silent, towering shadow behind her. "I am Evelyn," she said, keeping her chin high. "What has happened? Is my father ill?" "Your father is in perfect health, Miss Halloway," the solicitor said, stepping into the hall. He did not remove his hat. "He is, however, in considerable financial distress. The debts from your sister Clara's season have come due. He has made the difficult decision to liquidate his secondary assets." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Secondary assets. Oakhaven is to be sold," the solicitor said flatly, pulling a sealed document from his leather satchel. "The buyer is a wealthy merchant who wishes to clear the land for sheep grazing. You have 1 week to pack your belongings. Your father has secured a small cottage for you in Yorkshire. It is quite remote. You will not be bothered." The words hung in the damp air. Yorkshire. Remote. Liquidated. They weren't just hiding her anymore. They were erasing her entirely. Oakhaven was all she had. The tenant farmers, the fields, the people she had bled to protect. They would all be cast out so her father could pay for Clara's silk dresses. Evelyn reached out and gripped the edge of the hallway table to steady herself. The room spun. All the fire, all the strength she had built over the last 3 weeks, shattered like glass. "No," she whispered. "I have the deed of sale right here, miss," the solicitor said, holding out the paper. "It only requires your acknowledgement of the eviction notice." Evelyn reached for the paper with a trembling hand. Before her fingers could touch it, a large, calloused hand shot past her and snatched the document from the solicitor's grip. Roland stepped into the light of the hallway candles. The solicitor looked up, annoyed. "See here, you cannot simply—" The man stopped. He looked at Roland's face. He looked at the hard, aristocratic lines, the sheer size of the man, and the unmistakable, terrifying aura of a peer who was completely out of patience. The solicitor paled, his eyes darting to the signet ring on Roland's left hand. "Your Grace," the man stammered, removing his hat so fast he nearly dropped it. I did not realize you were in residence." Roland didn't look at him. He broke the seal on the document. He scanned the legal jargon with ruthless speed. "Lord Halloway owes £20,000 to his creditors." Roland read aloud, his voice dangerously calm. "He is selling this estate for £5,000 to cover a fraction of the debt. Yes, Your Grace, it is a distress sale." Roland slowly folded the paper. He looked at the solicitor. "Tell Lord Halloway the estate is no longer for sale." "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." The solicitor blinked. "The merchant has already made the offer." "I don't give a damn about the merchant," Roland said. He stepped forward. The solicitor instinctively took a step back, pressing against the damp wall. "Tell Lord Halloway that the Duke of Westmoreland is purchasing the entirety of his debt, all £20,000. Evelyn gasped. "Roland, no, you cannot do that. That is charity." "It is a hostile takeover," Roland corrected, looking over his shoulder at her. He turned back to the solicitor. "I will assume the debt. In exchange, Lord Halloway will sign the deed to Oakhaven over to me. Tonight. Tonight. Your Grace, Lord Holloway is in London. Then you will ride fast. Roland snarled. If you do not return with the signed deed by Thursday, I will buy the promissory notes from his creditors, call in the debt immediately, and have Lord Holloway thrown into Fleet Prison for insolvency. Do you understand me? The solicitor was sweating profusely despite the cold. Perfectly, Your Grace. I will leave immediately. The man scrambled out the door, nearly tripping over the threshold, and fled into the night. Silence descended on the hallway. Evelyn stared at Roland's back. Her chest was heaving. She was furious. She was terrified. She was utterly overwhelmed. "How dare you?" she breathed. Roland turned around. "How dare I what? How dare you buy my home?" Evelyn shouted, stepping toward him, her hands balled into fists. "I am not one of your estates. I am not a problem for you to solve with a checkbook. I told you I didn't want your charity. I told you I didn't want to be a kept woman." "You are not going to be a kept woman," Roland yelled back, his own temper flaring. He closed the distance between them, grabbing her shoulders. "I am not buying Oakhaven for myself, Evelyn. I have 20 estates. I don't need a leaky manor in Somerset." "Then why did you buy it?" "So I can give it to you." Roland let go of her, running a hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling heavily. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. He didn't open it. He just held it in his hand. "I am not asking you to come to London to hide," Roland said, his voice dropping, rough with emotion. "I am asking you to come to London to rule. The Ton is a battlefield, Evelyn. They are shallow, they are vicious, and they are entirely predictable. I have been dying of boredom for 10 years because I had no one to fight alongside." He stepped closer. He took her scarred right hand and placed the velvet box into her palm, folding her stiff fingers over it. "I don't want a wife who plays the harp. I want a duchess who knows how to break a dam. I want a partner who will look a duke in the eye and threaten him with a pickaxe." Roland looked down at her, his slate-grey eyes entirely stripped of their defenses. "I want you, exactly as you are. Scars, temper, and all." Evelyn looked down at the box in her hand. She didn't need to open it. She could feel the weight of what it meant. Autonomy, protection, partnership. She looked up at Roland. The cynical fortress she had lived in for 3 years finally, completely crumbled. "If I go to London," Evelyn said, her voice shaking, a tear finally spilling over her lashes, "I will not wear gloves." Roland smiled. It was a beautiful, lethal thing. "Good," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "Let them look. Let them see exactly who holds my leash." He kissed her, deep and hard, claiming her not as a savior, but as an equal. Tomorrow they would ride for London. Tomorrow they would face the shock, the whispers, and the scandal. But tonight, in the damp, draughty hallway of a saved manor, Evelyn Holloway finally stopped surviving. She began to live. Sometimes the greatest romance isn't found in a perfectly choreographed waltz, but in the mud, the rain, and the willingness to fight for someone who thought the world had thrown them away. Roland and Evelyn proved that true partnership is about seeing the scars and recognizing the strength it took to survive them. If you loved this story of slow-burn defiance and gritty romance, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel and share this video to help me create more grounded, emotional historical dramas. Let me know in the comments, what was your favorite moment between the Duke and Evelyn? See you in the next story.